This week, Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, became the lowest rated Star Wars movie on Rotten Tomatoes, coming in even below The Phantom Menace. I wanted to take a second to talk about the Rotten Tomato scores for all of the Star Wars movies, talk about why I think they are bullcrap, and they really don't represent the quality of the film. What's up, everybody? It's Josh. Welcome back to the channel, and a happy Star Wars Sunday to you if you were watching this on Sunday. And if not, no big deal, but you should know we drop dope Star Wars videos every single Sunday. Now, this news popped up way early in the week. Yes, it is true. Now, The Rise of Skywalker is the lowest rated Rotten Tomatoes score out of all of the Star Wars movies. It comes in even below The Phantom Menace, but I took my time with this. I didn't really want to touch it at first. I thought a lot about it. I did a lot of research, looked at the Rotten Tomato scores for all of the other Star Wars films, and basically I just have some thoughts. So I want to go over those today. But I should say, first of all, I am not here to tell you that if you don't like a particular movie, you are wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. By and large, everybody can just have their opinions. They can like certain Star Wars movies. They can not like certain Star Wars movies. But when I looked at the Rotten Tomato scores for the Star Wars movies, I think it tells a really interesting story, and it is not exactly telling you even what the critics actually think about these films as movies in their own right. So feel free, like it, don't like it. You know, you love The Last Jedi, you hate Rise of Skywalker, vice versa, all of those things. Whatever you're feeling, you're free to feel that way. But I just think, honestly, when you look at these Rotten Tomato score, for all of the films, they tell a different story than just like, oh, this was a bad one, this was a good one. It's actually more interesting than that, and I wanted to get into that. I also feel like I wouldn't be being 100% real if I didn't talk about my frustrations with certain people on the internet holding up the bad Rotten Tomato score for The Rise of Skywalker as though it is some kind of victory or some kind of positive thing for them, when many of these people held up the incredibly high, one of the highest, in fact, Rotten Tomato scores for The Last Jedi as being completely out of touch and not actually reflecting what fans thought. It's like, I agree with them, but I agree with their original statement about what these scores mean for actual Star Wars fans. But in all honesty, I think we can start right there. Start with The Last Jedi. The fact that the most divisive Star Wars movie of all time has the highest Rotten Tomato score out of anybody. And I truly believe, and I've talked to you guys about this before, but I truly believe that a lot of the people that reviewed The Last Jedi incredibly high actually reviewed Rise of Skywalker sort of lower than they normally would have, because they actually feel weird about having given Rian Johnson's movie such a high score. And actually, this is something that Jeremy Johns has talked about in a couple of his videos. Every single reviewer, every person that reviews a film, the review score that they have for that movie way later changes. So 2 years after The Last Jedi, I'm sure there are a lot of people in media, a lot of critics that regret giving Ryan's movie as high of a score as it got. But this kind of just goes into what I'm thinking as far as these scores and what they truly reflect. They actually reflect more of the contextual conversation that's going on with Star Wars than the quality of the films themselves, especially once removed. Like, once you remove yourself from these equations and you know, look back at these films years later, they age differently. I think the prequels are a perfect example of that. And if you look at what happened with the prequels, the lowest score comes from The Phantom Menace. But if you talk to many Star Wars fans out there, they will rate Attack of the Clones as the worst one in the series. But the way I look at the scores is like this. You have the original trilogy. It's the best. It's clearly the thing that started everything. It got the most fans on board. It was just, it's the best, right? You can't really touch the original trilogy. But when Star Wars was coming back, and when you found out that it was George Lucas basically making independent movies outside of the studio system, and he was going to be retelling or telling the story of a younger Anakin Skywalker, like, the anticipation for that was incredible. And I think that really the score for The Phantom Menace really reflects the expectations of the Star Wars fans, including the critics, and then what we got. And then similarly, if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score for Attack of the Clones, which is way higher, like way higher than The Phantom Menace, I think it again just reflects the context. It reflects after being so let down by Phantom Menace and looking for what was going to happen next. Attack of the Clones is more of a traditional narrative piece. It actually has protagonist, antagonist, and the relationship between Padme and Anakin. So it's way more of like a film where like you look at the Phantom Menace and it's just so all over the place. It's very hardly a film. It's hardly a singular narrative story. That's not really what George was doing with that one, right? But look at it. Like, I really do believe that the reviewers were like, okay, this is way more like a regular film. I'm gonna really give this a much better score because I like it contextually way more than what came before. And then Sith goes even higher in the ratings because it is actually a really good, well put together film. And even retractors of the prequel trilogy have to admit that there was a lot of really good stuff in Revenge of the Sith. But I think, having listened to a lot of these reviewers and just people in general, years later, Revenge of the Sith could even be rated higher. It is again being rated lower because it's all in this context. Well, this is a good movie. It's the best of the prequels, but it's still the prequels. They're still holding that over its head and refusing to give it a higher score than anything that really happens in the original trilogy. And it gets a little weirder when you go and look at the reviews for the original trilogy, because even though Rotten Tomatoes is an aggregate type of thing, it's just there's so many reviews that came decades after those original movies. It's really hard to get like a good depiction the same way we do with the prequels and the sequels with the original trilogy. But even then, you can look at the lowest film in that trilogy and it is Return of the Jedi. And I think, again, it is just this expectation of how you would end this Star Wars trilogy juxtaposed against what we got. When I look back at the original trilogy, I actually rate A New Hope the lowest, and not because it's a bad movie, but because I love Return of the Jedi, and that ending with Luke, Vader, and the Emperor is just fantastic. It's fantastic stuff. And Empire's obviously the highest because it's just like the best Star Wars movie we've ever gotten. So to me, it's again not really an accurate depiction of how the films actually are, but it's all in context. And I guess you could say, well, Star Wars is episodic. They're literally episodes, and you have to have the context in there. And I agree, but it's more than just the context of the story. It's really the context of the fan base and how people are reacting to what Star Wars is giving them. And if you look at the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens comes in super hot, man. People were loving this thing. I think it was the opposite effect of The Phantom Menace, where we hadn't had Star Wars in a long time. Star Wars was coming back. People were very excited for it. And then when it delivered, which, it delivered a very safe, sort of cookie cutter soft reboot, but it wasn't the prequels, right? It wasn't like, oh my God, what if they done with Star Wars? Which a lot of people felt from The Phantom Menace. And therefore, I think the rose-colored glasses were on with that movie, and that movie got way too high of a Rotten Tomatoes score as well. Now, I love that film, but I think it's just way too high. And then when you look at The Last Jedi by Rian Johnson, I truly think that what was going on with critics, most critics, while loving The Force Awakens, they also had to acknowledge that it was really nothing new. That, particularly 2 years later, after the rose-colored glasses came off for them, they had sat back and said, okay, well, we need something new, something fresh from Star Wars. Otherwise, I don't know if I can rate this that highly. And then Rian Johnson comes in and does something incredibly fresh. Whether you like it or you hate it, you have to admit that what Rian did was really breathe fresh life into Star Wars. He really subverted our expectations in a lot of different ways, which, is also a part of the problem with that movie. It's literally memeable that he's just doing it for doing its sake. But I think at the time, again, you juxtapose the expectation of the Star Wars fandom against what we got, and that's how you get as high of a Rotten Tomatoes score as you get for The Last Jedi. And then Rise happens, right? What happened? Why does Rise dip so low? Well, I know some people out there will be like, well, because it's a worse movie. Well, I would say that it is certainly not as good as a narrative flow as either The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi, but I think there's a lot of really bold stuff in Rise, and I think that it certainly does not deserve to have the score that it does. Like, the fact that Rise has a lower score than Solo, a Star Wars story, boggles the mind. I don't understand that at all. I think Solo and Attack of the Clones are the two worst Star Wars movies ever made, and they should have very low scores. But what does the score reflect, right? In process of this thesis, in this framework that I presented with you guys, I think what Rise is really getting that score for is, again, the expectations of Star Wars fans with what this ending would mean. Many Star Wars fans wanted to believe that there was a plan from Lucasfilm, that this was all on tracks, and that we were going to get an ending in The Rise of Skywalker that made everything before make sense, make it all fit together very nice, and give us a perfect culminating ending to the 42-year history of Star Wars as a franchise, to perfectly wrap up the Skywalker saga. And it did not. Like, you know what I mean? Even when I was on the leak train, which I knew what the movie was going to be. We knew what the ending was going to be for a long, long time. Slight changes happened to the ending, like the Reylo kiss was added. But at the end of the day, we knew what was going to happen. I knew for sure months out that this film was not going to be a good ending to the Skywalker saga, that was just a marketing thing. And at first that really upset me. It really upset me that Disney would do that, because it sucks, man. It's not an actual ending to the Skywalker saga. I knew also a long time ago that no, there was no plan from Disney. There was no through line of narrative thinking. They made the movie they made to try to fix problems that they had done before, and it is really disjointed. So I, again, think that the score for The Rise of Skywalker is really a score for the sequel trilogy. It's like there were a ton of Star Wars fans, and possibly even critics as well, that had blinders on. They didn't realize there were problems being created over at Lucasfilm. And even though I'm very positive on Star Wars, and there's a lot of great stuff in Disney Star Wars, and I can't wait to see what we get next, I was telling you guys from like a year and a half ago that there were problems with Star Wars, that even though there were very loud haters on the internet that were being buttholes about it, it didn't mean that they were all necessarily wrong about what was going on with Star Wars, that The Last Jedi had turned off a lot of Star Wars fans, whether they were very loud about it or not. It really was a film that should not have been made and divided the fandom. And I don't think Lucasfilm would make the movie they made in Rise of Skywalker if they hadn't seen in the numbers the same thing that I was seeing, the same thing that other people were seeing, the decline of the brand value because of choices made in that film that seemed to fly right in the face of fans that had been loving this stuff for decades. And so in some way, I think that this was sort of a harsh awakening. You know what I mean? A sort of bitch slap of truth to a lot of these people, where after they saw The Rise of Skywalker, they were like, whoa, okay, there's clearly something wrong here. There was clearly no planning. There's clearly disjointedness going on behind the scenes. Why would they take that many shots at The Last Jedi and all of these different things? It was a reality that I had been living in for a long time, and I understood. But for many other people, including many of the critics that denied that the leaks could be true for months and months and months, once they saw it and realized that the leaks were real and realized that Disney had made the film they had made because of The Last Jedi, I think there's so much animosity and confusion sort of all just came down upon The Rise of Skywalker. And that's why critics are ripping it apart to the degree to which they are. And I honestly gotta think that's where a lot of the vitriol and hate is coming from right here. It's like when The Last Jedi happened, there were a lot of people super turned off by that film and had realized that there was something going wrong at Star Wars. A lot of other people that liked it just put blinders onto that fact and tried to ignore a whole group of people that did feel disenfranchised from that film. And I can see why, because some of the loud buttholes on the internet really didn't do that side any favors as far as the perception goes. They really didn't. They didn't make it easy for people to have any empathy for those people, and a lot of this was thought of as a vocal minority, right? But Disney, I promise you, Disney would not have made the film they made with Rise if they didn't see in the data some of the things that I had been talking to you guys about. And so I think that's where we're at. It's this huge, raw awakening of all these emotions. And I think the reason the film is given as bad of a score as it has been given has less to do with the quality of the actual movie and more to do with the expectations and the desire for people to want Star Wars to be this totally pristine, finely tuned, well put together thing. They didn't want to admit that there was no plan, right? They didn't want to admit that Rian Johnson took so many left turns from what JJ wanted, and it did create problems. They didn't want to admit that there were lack of sales and lack of interest and dying down, waning empathy for Star Wars, all of these things. And now it's without a doubt true. And I think that there was just this sort of vomiting and like refusal to acknowledge that the film isn't actually as bad as The Phantom Menace. Certainly not from a film perspective. It is not. I think, honestly, it deserves somewhere between a 60 and a 70. In my opinion, a 70%. And I love the movie, but I agree. It's like a 70, right? It's like a C. It's a high C, has some damn fine Star Wars in it, but it's not a great film in the way that Empire is, right? It's not a great film like some of these other Star Wars movies are. But those are my thoughts about the Rotten Tomatoes score scores when it comes to Star Wars movies and with the Rise of Skywalker. Frankly, I do not think that the Rise of Skywalker deserves the Rotten Tomatoes score that it has. I think that the Rotten Tomatoes score is more of a reflection of people's frustrations with the sequel trilogy and all this harsh reality that they came to after watching Rise. I think that's really what it reflects, which is fair. It's whatever. It's no sweat off my back. I still enjoy the film, and I still can't wait to see what we get next. And I also talked to you guys a little bit about how if you look at the other Rotten Tomatoes scores for these films, I do think they paint a different picture than just, is this a good Star Wars movie? Or I guess what I'm really trying to say is it doesn't represent what Star Wars fans will view the films as, right? Star Wars fans, for the most part, love Phantom Menace, don't like Attack of the Clones, and love Sith. The Rotten Tomatoes scores do not reflect that. So that's where I'm at. That's my hypothesis, but I, of course, want to know what you think about all of this in the comment section below. And now let's shout out Dale Franklin. Indeed, it is the Old Republic. That's the rumored video game that's being rebooted over at EA. By the way, Justin from the Den of Nerds Gaming did a breakdown of that. Really good video. We'll update you and let you know what's actually going on with that. So go check out that video. But shout out to Dale Franklin. It is indeed the Old Republic, rumored to be getting a rework. Now let's check the nerd card before we get out of here. I want to know, what is the name of Obi-Wan Kenobi's astromech droid in the prequel trilogy? Unfortunately, gets destroyed in Revenge of the Sith, but what was the name of Obi-Wan's astromech droid? Answer that question in the comment section below. As I always say, I hope you're having an awesome and a nerdy day, and I'll see you in the next video.